delighted to welcome you all to tonight's Conservative Book of the Year Awards ceremony. And my colleague Dan McCarthy has the run of show and will be taking the lead for us. So before I kick it over to him, I'm going to introduce him. He is ISI's Vice President for the Collegiate Network, as well as the editor of ISI's journal, Modern Age, which you all have at your seats. And Modern Age just introduced and launched a new website, which you should go look at modernagejournal.com. And with that, I will turn it over to Dan. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you for joining us this evening. ISI has been educating for liberty on America's troubled campuses since 1953. Our founder, Frank Chodorov, believed it was not enough to complain about socialism and anti-Western ideology. We have to teach the alternative, the roots of our civilization. The ISI Henry and Anne Paluchis Book Award honors writers who have excelled in defining the crisis of our times and instructing us, indeed reminding us, of the solutions. The award is made possible by the generous gifts of Henry and Anne Paluchis, two remarkable individuals who together became an extraordinary force. Anne Paluchis was educated at Barnard College and Columbia University. She taught at City College of New York and became the first university research professor at St. John's University in New York. She was a scholar of the Renaissance, of the theater, of aesthetics. She was an author, and she was the founder and president of the Council on National Literatures. She also established the CNL Anne and Henry Paluchis International Conference Center in New York. Her husband and kindred spirit, Henry Paluchis, was a graduate of City College of New York. He served in the nascent U.S. Air Force in the Second World War and later earned his PhD from Columbia University. A man of action as well as scholarship, Professor Paluchis was instrumental in the growth of the Conservative Party of New York. As a scholar, he taught at Iona College, Brooklyn College, City College, Columbia University, and St. John's University in New York. We are grateful to the memory of the Paluchis and for the presence of their friends and family tonight. Senator Serafim Maltese, Clara Sarocchio, Michael Michel, and Azar Atura. We are also very grateful for the support tonight of Athos, a powerhouse literary and publicity agency, and its co-founder, Jonathan Brunitsky. Now let me tell you about our honoree, a man whose ideas and reporting are at the vanguard of a counter-revolution against the radicals who have hijacked our nation's institutions. Christopher Rufo is a senior fellow and the director of the Initiative on Critical Race Theory at the Manhattan Institute. He is a contributing editor at City Journal and the author of the New York Times bestseller, for which we recognize him tonight, America's Cultural Revolution, How the Radical Left Conquered Everything. His research and activism exposing critical race theory have inspired a presidential executive order and legislation in more than 20 states. As a filmmaker, he has directed documentaries for PBS, Netflix, and international television. He holds degrees from Georgetown University and Harvard, although in the latter case, they certainly resent him for it. And he lives in the Pacific Northwest with his wife and 3 sons. Tonight, he joins us here in the heart of the swamp in Washington, D.C. Please welcome Chris Rufo.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Let's not drop the award, shatter it. That'd be a little embarrassing. It's great to be here to be honored for a book. This is my first book. I've directed films, which is a much more active enterprise. You go into some forgotten territory, you spend a year of your life observing something in the wild, and then spend time huddled in a dark room editing something into shape. By contrast, the book is actually much easier. So it's been kind of a fun thing to do, to write this book. But what I think I'd like to talk about briefly tonight is that, a book can either be dead or alive. There are many books that are kind of spiritually or politically dead, even if they have some intellectual content to them. But what I tried to do with this book is to make sure that it was not oriented just towards good prose, solid research, a good line of argument, some historical value, but it was actually oriented towards active political life. And so the subject of the book is political life. It's one story, I think a very important story of the last half century of American political life, looking at how a radical left-wing political movement that never achieved popularity, that never achieved an electoral majority, was able to conquer public and private institutions through extra-parliamentary measures, and what impact that's had on us. And so the story is a historical story, telling the history of this movement, telling the progression of ideas through institutions. It's a biographical story. I tell the biographical history of 4 of the leading intellectuals of this period. Let's see if I remember it. I haven't written this book in a while. Herbert Marcuse, Paulo Freire, Angela Davis, and Derek Bell. For those of you who are not familiar with them, Herbert Marcuse was a critical theorist, one of the founders of the discipline of critical theory. He was also the godfather of the New Left in the late 1960s. In the United States, as well as in European capitals, for a brief blaze of glory, student radicals were carrying banners that said, Marx, Mao, Marcuse. Those were it'd be the philosopher, the pen, the sword, and the prophet. That's how he was conceptualized for a period. And if you read his work and you study his life, you realize that the conceptual framework that he established in a relatively brief period, mid-1960s to the mid-1970s, about 10 years, is still the dominant intellectual framework that the left operates on today, whether they know it or not. Many people don't. Paulo Freire was a Brazilian Marxist pedagogist. He happens to also be the 3rd most cited author in all of the social sciences in the United States. Actually quite influential if you think about it. He, for example, to give you a sense of his politics, called the Chinese Cultural Revolution, quote, the most genial solution of the century, to give you an idea of who his inspirations were. Angela Davis, of course, is the Black Panther Party, Communist Party USA, kind of ethno-Marxist radical of the 1960s, who established a specifically ethnic radical political movement that was the precursor, inspiration, and carbon copy template for the Black Lives Matter movement that emerged half century later. Under her tutelage, not only intellectually, but actually directly. And if you read Angela Davis's work, or if you read it digested through my book, you'll find that all of the phrasing, all of the concepts, all of the rhetorical lines, all of the political tactics, even all of the aesthetic references of the Black Lives Matter movement that crested in 2020 was established by Angela Davis by 1969. And the last person on the list of infamy was Derek Bell, who was the founder, or rather the godfather, of critical race theory. So if you look at this as a progression, you could see it starting with critical theory, then there's kind of race radicalism, merged together on the Harvard Law campus with Professor Derek Bell, who became an influential figure of taking many of these ideas from the fringes into the centers of power. And he was also a campus activist. Many of the techniques that bureaucrats have used to gain power within, for example, universities or government agencies, we now know it affectionately as DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Derek Bell developed a lot of those techniques in the 80s and 90s and created this kind of pessimistic, pseudo-radical movement that occupied positions then of power and prestige over time. But what I think is actually interesting about all of these figures is not their intellectual work. If you look at it purely abstractly, with the exception of Marcuse, who actually is a heavyweight intellectual, there's some real, even if you disagree with it, you cannot deny that he has a certain depth of thought, a serious scholar. The other ones, their intellectual work is lacking. It's shallow by comparison. But what's interesting about them is that their intellectual work was oriented towards practical power. It was an intellectual enterprise that had political praxis embedded within it, And they were actually willing to do the political work of getting those ideas into positions of authority, to take hegemony over institutions. And lo and behold, there were two phases to this revolution. The first, not so successful. The second, quite successful. The first was an explicit Marxist-Leninist guerrilla warfare revolution. The Black Panther Party, when that became not radical enough, it splintered into the Black Liberation Army. You had the Weather Underground and this other network of movements. And for those of you, I know everyone here is under 50, but for those of us who are a little younger and might not remember it, I was actually shocked to understand in the research the level of intensity of that period. There were something like more than 2,000 politically motivated bombings in the United States each year in the beginning of the 1970s. Dozens of airlines were being hijacked every year, many of which were for political causes or political agitation. And some of these groups were assassinating police officers in New York and Georgia and San Francisco. They were bombing the U.S. Capitol, bombing the Pentagon, bombing police stations, and murdering judges in an extremely intense period. And the theory was, we can take from Mao's Cultural Revolution, we can take from the Marxist-Leninist guerrillas of Central America, we can adopt these tactics and have revolution in the United States. It was delusional, but for a bit they had some hope. And then, maybe to give us hope, you go from property bombings, assassinations, kind of guerrilla warfare, to the Richard Nixon 49-state landslide in about 2 years. The political culture shifted dramatically against this movement. But what happened then, the second phase of this campaign, which was more successful, was one that was more insidious. It was not a long march that Chairman Mao executed to the highlands of central China, where he regrouped and then destroyed the nationalists through physical violence. It was what the German Marxist student radical Rudi Dutschke called the Long March Through the Institutions. This was a peaceful but subversive march. They knew very clearly, we will never get an electoral majority in the West, especially in the United States. Karl Marx's proletariat, the factory workers in Detroit, or the people in the tire factories down in Tennessee, or any kind of industrial workers, were uninterested in revolution. Herbert Marcuse actually said, the proletariat in the United States is explicitly counter-revolutionary. They're not with us. And rather than maybe reconsider his politics, he said, we need a revolution of the intellect, a revolution of elites at the top level, and then a revolution of the lumpen proletariat, in Marxist terminology. The people at the margins of society that can be motivated towards physical violence and physical pressure. What do we see today? What's critical race theory? It's an academic discipline that has captured elite institutions with public funding, even though in many cases the public never voted for these ideas to be installed. It's not just in California and New York. It's actually, almost everywhere. It's in Florida. It's in Texas. Well, we're taking care of that a little bit. But the point being is that these ideas proliferated and propagated through the institutions, and the real question is how. That's the question that I sought to answer in the book. That's the driving question that I think is important. When you see your opponent, your enemy in a certain language, successful in the same game that you're playing, the worst answer is to say, well, they're bad, they're stupid, they don't know what they're doing, it doesn't work. The better question is to ask, well, how did they do it? And what can you learn from it? And then how can you adjust your own politics to respond effectively? And so if you read the book, there are two, I tried to put two layers into it. Some people caught on. I was really excited about that. But the explicit text is this history. But the embedded text is a process of learning, teaching, adapting, assimilating ideas, tactics, strategies, because we're fighting in a different environment. If you watch a movie like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, anyone know that movie? Yeah. It's like, we're so far beyond that, you know. I mean, great movie, very sweet, very touching. But we are in a Gramscian-style, trench-by-trench war in which Mr. Smith would be decapitated instantly. You know, the poor bastard wouldn't stand a chance. And so rather than hearken back with a sense of nostalgia of how things ought to be, or lamenting that that is not the way that it is today, we have to fight in a better way. And so much of my time the last few years, rather for the year that I had to write this book in, Jonathan negotiated a great contract for me. He got me a whole year to write the book. They wanted to turn it around in like 3 months. You know, originally, like publishers, I asked, how much time some of the books? Some of these books turn around in 3 months. It's like, I can't do this in 3 months. That seems impossible. Get as much time as you can, you know. But a lot of the time that I spent was writing this book. I think probably my habit, I guess, was get in the office at 8, jumble around on Twitter for like 90 minutes, take a phone call maybe, write the book, and then do other stuff at the end of the afternoon. But as I was writing this book, thinking about these ideas, looking at these tactics, I was also adapting some of them in some of these very public fights that I've been engaged in the previous few years. First starting, every year there's like a theme. That's kind of how I've stumbled into it. The first year, 2021, was the fight against, end of 2020, but really 2021 was the fight against critical race theory. If you believe the New Yorker magazine, I am the conservative activist who invented the conflict over critical race theory. And some of my friends said, oh, that's awful, that's dishonest. You didn't invent the conflict, it was, it's a real thing. But in another sense, it's not exactly wrong either. There's a phenomenon that exists in the world, but until you name it, until you bring it to public consciousness, until you polarize it, and until you turn it into a real political fight, that's a process of invention in some ways, right? You have a conception of how the world is, a conception of how you want the world to be, but that actually doesn't matter until you get it off the page and into the political arena. The next year I was doing some reporting on gender theory in schools, gender theory in hospitals, exposing some of the, kind of Aztec-level human sacrifice that's happening in children's hospitals. Very dark. I did a story, for example, about a doctor in Portland, Oregon, who has invented and deployed a child castration robot. You think it's dystopian, you don't know the half of it. It actually gets much worse. And then last year, my big campaign was against the DEI bureaucracy. And so I'd like to tell you a little bit about that campaign in more detail because it's the most recent. And I think that it is relevant to this book. We're talking about a book because, again, getting off the page, I wrote the book 2 years ago about the creation of this DEI bureaucracy, about the threat of this DEI bureaucracy. And in the past year, after the book was done, published, I got about destroying it. That was my explicit goal. And so in January of last year, I laid out a policy paper with Manhattan Institute, abolish the DEI bureaucracy and restore colorblind equality in America's institutions. I made an announcement with a very special person, Governor Ron DeSantis of the state of Florida. We held an event together where we laid out the campaign, abolish, destroy, and salt over the DEI bureaucracy in every state university in the state of Florida. Start there. Start with the most courageous leaders. That's always a good place to start. And then go state by state, just wiping this thing out, restricting it, stopping it, preventing it from further entrenching itself. Because you have this problem of hegemony. You have a kind of ostensible political hegemony in Florida, supermajority, governor, Texas, majority, governor. God forbid you go to like the South Dakota, massive, it's not even a supermajority, it's whatever it is, it's a hypermajority, let's say. But why are your state universities run by DEI bureaucracies and pushing race and gender theory? You have political control, but your opponents have political hegemony, right? It's a different thing. When we announced this campaign, it was denounced by everybody, actually like many people. This is a right-wing evil plot, to do whatever. I don't know. I don't pay too much attention to it. But, it was seen as a fringe right-wing idea. By summertime, the New York Times invited me to publish an op-ed making the case for abolishing the DEI bureaucracy, conquering some territory. And by the end of the year, we had effectively begun the process of abolition in, 5 or 6 states. Taking territory, changing institutions, moving the law, shifting incentives, creating space for our ideas to replace their ideas. And I think that one final point that is important, and this is actually the flaw of the critical theories and the place where I think we can actually have a chance to overcome them, to transcend them, to truly replace them as the guiding philosophy, the guiding ideology. Let's not give it too much credit. It's not a philosophy. But the critical theories operate on the principle of negation, deconstruction, dismantling, whatever. They have these great Latinate words, Some academics spend a bunch of time thinking, how can I say something very simple? Grab the thesaurus. Let's figure out a way to sound smart when we're saying this thing. But it all really leads to the same thing. They think America is evil. They think our institutions are evil. They think our principles are evil. They think the economic system is evil. They want to destroy it. ... And then a utopia will emerge spontaneously from that. That's kind of Marcuse literally says this. He says, I don't know what it'll look like after. But after we destroy it, I think something great is going to happen. And he was saying that after it was well known what had happened in the communist regimes of the 20th century, making it a totally irresponsible position. Okay, conservatives, you might not like this, but early 20th century, 1910, you can almost forgive people. Radical labor unions, let's say you're living in Russia in 1910. It's not like exactly a great place to be, serf, and you could say, well, maybe this ideology has a chance. Maybe it will be better. You can't say that by the 1970s, 1980s, God forbid by the 2000s. Let's get real with this. But what we have to offer is something that goes beyond negation. It's a concrete set of principles that we can govern ourselves by. We can borrow from our founding, the principles that I think still work, still offer us a kind of more political, moral foundation that we can rebuild. And really what how I think of my work is, as Dan mentioned, it's the work of counterrevolution. And I was recently reading Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine was not a conservative, but he had this beautiful line in a letter that he wrote to a French minister. He said, the American Revolution was not really a revolution. It was a counter-revolution to recover lost rights and liberties. Does that sound familiar to our situation today? The colonists who were revolting over the taxation, right? This is like a heavy tax. What do you think the tax rate was that they were sending to the king, to the parliament? It was 1% to 2%. They're like, we're going to fight you to the death over a 1% tax. We've become so complacent. I'm from California. They're like, 50%, we can compromise there. But not a penny more than 50%. But I think we have to get very aggressive. I think we'd have to learn from our enemies and then encourage our friends. And what I try to wake up and do every day, I live in a small town in Washington State. I would say I live in Washington. They say, oh, what neighborhood? Georgetown or whatever. It's like, no, Washington State. And then I get very puzzled stares. Like, you live where? But what I try to wake up and do every day is to put victories on the board. Because I'm of the mind that even a small victory opens up new possibilities. You learn something by the process of trying, maybe failing. But I actually think, people say, you learn most from your failures. No, you learn most from your victories. And victories create other opportunities. They have this beautiful effect where new veins of possibility open up. New contacts, new information, new resources, new people. And we need to increase the tempo of our victories. You know, we don't need 5-year strategic plans. We need like 50-day strategic plans. Victory after victory after victory. Show people that it's possible. We have a demoralized political movement. And I think that one of the most important things we can do is to remoralize it. I mean, remoralize it in the sense of like, you know, no drag queens in kindergarten. That's one way to do it. But I really mean remoralize in the sense of remotivating people, reminding them why we're fighting, reminding them what the problems are, naming the enemy, and then calling them to defeat it. I think it's very possible. I think that we are in a situation that is more perilous than it's ever been. But in some ways, we have enough of a base and enough of a possibility of success that it's absolutely worth fighting. So thanks for the award. Thank you for coming, and we'd love to have the discussion and get some questions after the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Those were wonderful remarks. And I actually want to begin where you left off, talking about victories. Have we reached a turning point in the campaign to expose and defeat DEI, critical race theory, and other such things? Because we've seen these victories in Florida and a number of other states. Is the enemy now somewhat in retreat? Is their advance at least arrested? Or are they perhaps gathering for a counteroffensive at some point?
So in the ideal, our republic is supposed to be governed by the majority opinion, with some, institutional constraints, checks and balances, and so forth. But the founders are actually quite clear on this. A republic, a democracy, is essentially the rule of public opinion. Machiavelli even said it before that. But we're in a very strange position where you see this locally in, let's say, blue cities, and you see this more broadly in red states and then in our country. The public is against kind of left-wing racialist ideology. The public is against the kind of derangement of the public university system. The public is against, gender ideology and secret child sexual transitions in schools. Look at any of the polling data. These are all 70%, 80% issues, but they're not policy. And so, to me, the political work is twofold. One, you have to dominate public opinion. You have to create the language, you have to feed it into the media cycle, and then you have to polarize a strong majority of the public in your favor, because politicians are lagging indicators. Politicians get comfortable when it's a little safer in general, state legislators especially so. So you have to create the conditions for them to not have courage, fortitude, principles, all these beautiful things, but actually it's easier to do the thing than to not do the thing. So the public opinion is, I think, the basis of this. But then there's an institutional problem. I think ideologically we've defeated these ideologies, in the sense that if you look at the public polling, we're in a strong position against them. So some say, oh, well, therefore, woke has peaked. You ever heard that? People say that, like some stupid columnist language. The woke is we're peak woke, post woke. Okay, yeah, measured by public opinion, maybe it's crested, but not bureaucratically and administratively. When you have people you have now tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people whose livelihoods depend on promoting these ideas in institutions, K-12 school system, public university system, federal bureaucracy. When they have functional control over the institution, the job is not done, and mobilizing public opinion doesn't matter. The next step, which is much more difficult, although we're making progress there too, we're having fun, is to actually change the composition of the institutions, change the leadership of the institutions, and to replace the people of the institutions with different people with better ideas. That's a lot harder. And so I kind of jokingly and kind of not jokingly say, we need like a pink slip counter-revolution. We need to have like the pink paper printers at maximum production, because ultimately these victories can only be made real and made meaningful if we have a return almost to a spoils-style system. When we win control of the government, of the political system, we were in control of the institutions, and they advance our principles. That, to me, is the harder fight, and I think we're slowly trying to figure that out, but it's far from over.
You know, your remarks brought up a curious paradox, which is that we have many states where, as you said, we perhaps even have a hypermajority of conservative legislators or legislators who consider themselves conservative, who are Republicans, and yet we see that the institutions of education, the institutions of character formation in many cases, are dominated still by the left. I also think, I'm a few years older than you, and I think back to the America that I grew up in, which was a much more conservative America than we have today. And yet somehow, some complacency or some weakness on the part of that stronger and more virtuous America opened the door to the insanity that we've seen in the last 20 plus years. I'm curious, what do you think has created this sense of complacency or this obliviousness among so many conservative people towards the threat that they're facing from a very radical, revolutionary left?
Well, I'd like to, with somewhat tongue-in-cheek, I'd like to blame two groups of people on the right. I'd like to blame baby boomers, and I'd like to blame libertarians. And I won't just launch that out there. I'll explain why. Baby boomers inherited a world, conservative baby boomers, let's say, inherited a world in which we had won the existential struggle with communism. We'd defeated the Soviet Union. We'd relegated it to a kind of forgotten, evil period in history that could never be resurrected again. And then people did a couple things. They retreated to economic life, running businesses, making money. They retreated to maybe religious and spiritual life, going to church, taking care of the people around them. Good. Make money, take care of your people. These are good things. But I think they abdicated the public square. They didn't feel like they felt like the threat was over and they could relax. Angela Davis, all the people who were still alive, still pushing, they didn't take the defeat of the Soviet Union as a defeat. They took it as a temporary setback. The second group, and I can say this because I used to maybe be one, is libertarians. Libertarians captured the kind of conservative mind with some truly damaging ideas. Institutional neutrality. If you think about it, we just need to make sure the institutions are neutral. Okay, all right. I always ask, libertarians, okay, great, that's a good idea. But help me out here. Name one institution in human history that has been neutral. It's very hard to answer because, of course, it's impossible. Institutions will be governed according to a set of principles and according to really one highest principle. Politics is a competition for what is at the top. Administratively, we like that. We got a president, but also intellectually, morally, spiritually even. What principle is the guiding principle that orients all the others? The left knows this. DEI. Our institutions are governed by this trio of principles. What is it for the right? What do we offer? You ask even conservative university presidents, what's the telos? What's the final cause of the university? Raising money, building new buildings. We've got a great football team this year. The trustees are very excited about it. Institutional neutrality gets you there. Institutional neutrality is unilateral surrender. That's what it amounts to in practice. And so you get conservatives who become the caretakers of their enemies' institutions. I'll be at the top, kind of symbolic figurehead. but everyone below is operating on a different set of principles. And so there's a whole series of them, but I think that's the most important one. And then like in education, two things that I think are just like, oh my God, it's such a big problem. We need to teach kids how to think, not what to think. A, how is that even logically possible? How do you teach a kid how to think without any content? And then B, if you evaporate all kind of content decisions, somebody else will fill those. You get Howard Zinn for your kindergarten class. You know, he's not teaching kids, and also it's a really irresponsible thing to do. Kids don't know anything. You actually have to teach them, at least for a while, what to think. That's important. This is the value that we're trying to transmit from one generation to the next. And the other thing, and this is kind of a Bush administration thing, and then and then subsequently is this kind of reduction of education into a material science, in which the test score line goes up. One problem is that the test score line never goes up. Like 50 years, it's been completely flat. But the bigger problem is not that. That's a horrible goal for education. To reduce it to test score line goes up, what you're essentially doing is saying, we want IQ to go up, which is like kind of it's an uncomfortable thing for people to talk about, but it's also like, how do you do it? That doesn't really make any sense. This seems like a poor objective. We don't know how to do this. The purpose of education, if you go back to Aristotle, Book 8 of the Politics, Aristotle's great statement on education is in a book called The Politics, which gives you a sense of how it should be embedded. And he says something that is completely true. You should educate children into the political regime. You should form their character to the type of society that you want to maintain. Are we educating our children into a kind of Republican set of virtues and habits and principles? Not at all. You sound like a crazy person if you even say something like that. And so I think we've abdicated on those fronts.
Your remarks have put me in mind of a rather dark passage in Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, where he predicts that the path towards what he calls democratic despotism, where people will willingly, voluntarily give up their culture, their freedom, everything to some centralized tutelary power, is going to come about through what he calls individualism, which sounds like he may be criticizing kind of libertarians avant la lettre, but in fact what he means is a retreat into the wholesome parts of life that nonetheless leave the public square and politics empty. So you get people concentrating on family, concentrating on religion, which are good things, but to the extent that they withdraw from politics, they then leave politics to be colonized by the power of despotism. And I think you're quite right as well, that there's a way in which both the libertarian flaws and also the flaws of the baby boomers combined for a whole generation of conservatives, not just among the boomers, but perhaps even people of Generation X, like my own generation, which is there was this feeling among conservatives that once the left was defeated in the Cold War, once there were other things that were stopped, in individual battles, that the natural course would reassert itself and people would return to the sort of the Maybury kind of environment that had been imagined, in an earlier part of America. And that wasn't the case, that in fact, simply retreating from the public square and going back to private life, although you could have a nice gated community, you could have a nice, your particular parish might be fine. The institutions of higher education, the institutions of politics, the federal bureaucracy, all of that was being corrupted, weaponized, and used against us, and now we see what's happened. So with that being said, what do you see as the role models or examples that you would look to as exemplars that have succeeded in changing things for the better, resisting revolutionary movements? Who do you look to for inspiration?
Ooh, historically or contemporary?
Historically and contemporary.
Well, I think that you can look to the founding for some historical exemplars, absolutely. And one thing that I do and this strikes at the theme that we're talking about. We're talking about ideas and power, the relationship between the two, tension between the two. There's a tendency, I think, among people like me, who write for a living and think for a living, and desk-bound peoples. There's this kind of vision of the founders that you get that I see in among many conservatives. That is very rosy. They were aloof statesmen above it all. They ruled by the pen through principle. And then you actually read about the biographies, you read about their lives, and it's like, no, these were unruly. Samuel Adams, had a trained mob of liberty men that were tarring and feathering and chasing people out of town and forcibly, commandeering ships. These were people that had the spirit of conflict. They understood politics at its most essential. It's a form of conflict. And so I think, we'd like to always have the conflict of persuasion, right? That's the ideal form of conflict in a republic. The first language of the republic is the language of persuasion. But we're not even really willing to do that. And so I think that is one, certainly inspiration. But then I think for other kind of more practical kind of methods, I look to the left. I think that there's probably, no more practically valuable book than reading Antonio Gramsci. And actually, if you read Gramsci, what's kind of amazing is he actually sounds very conservative. You read Gramsci talking about the importance of family, against kind of libertinism and dissolution. You read Gramsci about humanistic education, bringing education away from the drudgery of training for a kind of mechanical, materialist society and elevating people through the great tradition of the West. And you say, my God, Antonio Gramsci is now a reactionary, if he were to publish this today. And so I think that you also have to look at the winners, right? As examples. And so it maybe sound kind of odd, maybe sound kind of weird, and you have to separate out the bad ideas, obviously. It's a sifting process. But look, the last century, you have to study the winners. And I think one thing I think about in this question right now is today the United States has a larger government, measured as a percentage of GDP, than communist China. I lived in China, so I know that it's not an exact comparison. They have problems. We have much more freedoms here. But in an important sense, we have a larger state than communist China. That should tell you where we are as a country and kind of raise your thinking to a new level of seriousness.
What surprised you most about studying figures like Gramsci or Marcuse? What did you find in them that you didn't expect, perhaps, to encounter?
You always, there's a kind of genre. The book that I wrote is not a new thing. People have been talking about the Long March through the Institutions. People have been talking about a phrase that I don't use in the book purposely, called cultural Marxism. I didn't use it because it's kind of loaded. It's a conflict word. I kind of didn't want to, be the tinfoil hat. But then the New Republic published this massive piece, Christopher Rufo's Cultural Marxist Conspiracy Theory, and all about cultural Marxism. And then I politely pointed out, oh, that's interesting. Show me where in the text I call it cultural Marxism. I think the lady was pretty mad. But whatever. It's not a new story, right? I think it's a deepening. I think it's substantiated in a new way. But you get a certain genre of conservative book that treats these people as one-dimensional, evil cartoon villains. What was surprising to me, and what I really tried to do, is to actually look at it from the other perspective. What made these people so fascinating? What made them so charismatic? What made them take people from elite America and risk it all to fight for their ideals? And I think that's a much better way of approaching it. And so I had left-wing writers, like from very left-wing magazines, say, my God, I kind of liked your book, But I think one thing you can't do is dismiss people. Also, like, you're going to spend a year of your time engaging with people's lives and thinking about them and reading about them. It's like, you shouldn't hate them. You shouldn't, constantly dismiss them or have a smug sense about them. And so you should see them in a three-dimensional way. And I kind of put myself in the shoes of these milieu, right? It's like, well, there's something here that is attractive, something here that's idealistic, something here that's utopian, something here that is inspiring. And of course, they're like monsters, they're evil, their ideology is responsible for the deaths of many, many people. There's that too, that's the obvious point, right? But the less obvious point is, what was good about them? And I think that's something that I was fascinated with through the process.
Mm-hmm. Chris, you'll be very amused to hear that recently at modernagejournal.com, we had an interview with the left-wing feminist Naomi Wolf, who is somewhat unusual among feminists these days. She's very critical, actually, of the today's far left and censorious tendencies. And she actually used the phrase cultural Marxism.
Oh, good for her.
The next time, the New Republic wants to come after someone for that phrase, they should leave Chris Rufo alone. They can talk about Naomi Wolf. So,
and that's a good. The thing is, like, cultural Marxism is their phrase. If you look at even the academic scholarship in the 1990s, there's a Marcuse scholar, I think he was at UCLA. Great resource. He published all of Marcuse's collected works, letters, correspondence. I drew on this work quite a bit. Can't remember the fellow's name, but it's in the footnotes somewhere. And I'm reading his papers and looking at it, it's like, son of a bitch. This guy in like 1995, he's a lefty, is like, it was critical theory, cultural Marxism, Western Marxism. Those were their categories. And then they became a kind of preposterous, it's a right-wing conspiracy theory, it's an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. It's like, are you, what? I just spent I probably, I'm like the only best-selling author to write about critical race theory, so I kind of know something about it. I've sold more books than the critical race theorists, which is kind of a cool thing. But it's like, it's got nothing to do with what are you, people are nuts. This doesn't make any sense. But I think the important thing there is maybe an important lesson for all of us, and maybe an important lesson to close on and give some food for thought. Language matters. Language matters. It's critically important how we speak, and it's a kind of character test. Not a character test in the test that kind of virtue, but it's a character type, rather. That's a better way to put it. We need sophisticated people who understand language that can make sense, that has intellectual force, and that has emotional force. There's this idea that we should, the conservative thing, like you guys have heard this, this is like, okay, neutrality, all these problems that I have. The one thing that others drives me crazy is, facts don't care about your feelings. You've heard this? It's like a very smug thing to say, And I love Ben Shapiro. He became famous for that. And I saw Ben last night. I love Ben. Not a knock on him at all. He's a great communicator. But I think that is actually completely backwards. I think the facts really don't care about your, the facts don't care about your feelings. Much more so. What is it? Do I have it backwards? I don't know.
Feelings don't care about your facts.
Your feelings do not care about the facts. Have you ever persuaded your wife through a rigorous logical presentation? No. Has a car salesman ever sold you a Ferrari by nerding out on the details of the piston construction or whatever it is? I don't know. No. The Ferrari gives you a feeling because it's a beautiful car. And when you drive it, you feel powerful. And so we have to be contrary to this notion of having the strongest argument and the greatest logic. We have those things, I think. We need to have language that moves people, language that inflames people, and language that gets people out of the realm of a kind of passive existence and into politics, which means conflict, which means controversy, and which means fighting. Temperamentally, I like fighting. It's very suitable to me. But we need more people that are willing to get out there and fight these things out. And I think that the genesis of all this is strong and persuasive language. And so that's why it's such an honor to win a book award. I put many words into the book. They cut about 40,000 of the words out of the manuscript. It would have been even bigger, but I think this makes it very readable, and I'm so honored and grateful to get recognized in this way, and some great competitors this year, and so I really appreciate that.
Thanks, Chris. So we have time for some question and answer sessions from the audience, and there's a lot of questions. Let's start down here with the gentleman towards the front, and we have a mic that's coming down. And please identify yourself before you ask your question.
Good evening, William Kleiman, Compass Legal Group. I'll just get to the point. I think the principle I think we need to learn from the last few years, and the same line with Chris's work, is we can't fear to use power. But specifically, I want to ask one exercise of power. I'm very curious about Chris's opinion. The anti-TikTok bill. To me, it's, hey, let's take this by the horns, exercise power. But I think it's splitting the conservative movement a bit. So I wanted to get your take.
Yeah, I didn't read the bill, so I can't comment specifically on the text. I don't know if it's well written, poorly written. That stuff does matter. But as a general principle, this is kind of another free market blind spot. I'm a capitalist, I like to get paid. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I like to create value in the world. But the idea that you can give a foreign adversary unlimited access to your country with no terms and conditions, no reciprocity, no restrictions, is insane. I lived in China for a year in 2008, 2009. And I noticed something very interesting. Facebook, I don't think Twitter was invented yet, but there was like Facebook, there were some other social media MySpace, there's other social media platforms that were popular in the United States. They were banned in China. But what the Chinese did is they did copycats. I can't remember what it was called at the time, but you have a website that looks identical to Facebook, but it's some Chinese website. They massacre the intellectual property. It's like rampant IP theft. If you have an American company that's in China, at the time, I believe you have to give a Chinese partner a 51% stake. And 51%, why would they choose 51 and not 49? Oh, because then you have total control over the company. And so I think that even on a free market basis, look at Adam Smith. Adam Smith was a protectionist. But even if you say, hey, free trade in general is good, you have Pareto principles and Ricardian economics, okay, fine, I agree. But you have to have some kind of reciprocity. And if it's an adversary, you need to protect your people first and foremost. And so, I say just get rid of it. Why not? Further than what? The current bill does what? It has to transfer into American ownership? I think that's kind of a joke. Look, I've spent a year in China. The idea that they own TikTok, and then if the accountants and the lawyers change the domicile of the corporation and the ownership structure, that they're not going to have the same access is insane. You have to be naive to think that. They will have access to that. That's baked into it, And so if the argument is the CCP can't have access to a platform that is in all of our telephones, you have to just say no more, and then maybe say under the conditions that you let all of our social media apps work in China. That seems to be a prudent middle ground.
So I see a question from Michael Maybach, and then we'll go to the front after that. So go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks for doing this this evening. So one of the things I think that a lot of us run into, given that we're in a presidential year, is we have that Mr. Biden and Mr. Trump. And I'll be talking to somebody socially, and all of a sudden we break into camps. Are you for or against Trump or Biden? And these emotions come out on either side. And I will say, well, what policies do you want to talk about? It's really hard to talk about policies. Is that typical in America, or are we in a position now where we just can't talk about policy because of personality?
No, people don't care about policies. They care about people, personalities, trauma, and so that's it. I mean, and Trump has been a media star for 50 years? I mean, the guy's a phenomenon in that way, and he's very polarizing for obvious reasons. But I don't know. I've managed to avoid those conversations. If I'm like on an airplane and people ask me what I do, I say I run a private research firm. I made a couple mistakes in the past. We're like, oh, I'm in politics. It's like, I will never make that mistake again. Avoid those conversations. Don't get in those arguments. And then surround yourself with friends. I think that's the best way to do it.
Hi, I'm Bill Mower, and I'm running for Congress in Virginia's 8th District, a D+23 seat that I'm unlikely to win, but I'm fighting the good fight. I have to say I'm a little bit closer in age to the Generation X group, and not to disparage our young, lovely author here, but in my opinion, what we need most from the right is to unsilent the silent majority. We need to be as rude to the Democrats as they are to us every day of the week. And my question is, thank ISI for all the good work they do, putting good ideas in the hands of the next generation, and thank Christopher for his great work. I love the fact that he wants to not just be a warrior and burn the bridge between the left and the right, but to run over the bridge first and salt the land on the left side. But the fact of the matter is we're losing today. And we're losing today because we are not Ronald Reagan enough. We're not optimistic. We need optimistic leaders on the right. What can you do to fix that?
Yeah, I disagree. I disagree actually with almost everything that you said, and I'll explain why. You assume that we're in the majority. I'm not sure that is the case as it was in Nixon's time. Nixon had the great speech about the silent majority, the non-screamers, the non-shouters. I'm a Nixon super fan. I love Nixon. That was undoubtedly true then. I'm not sure it's true today. And then the idea about getting in people's faces, stop being so polite, stop being silent. I'm also not persuaded that that's a good thing. You can be rude to people, you can attack people, you can be vituperative with people, but if they control the institutions and hold the power, you're not actually doing anything. So don't mistake noise for effective political action. I'm almost never mean to people. I don't pick fights. I'm not involved in drama to the extent that I can. I try not to get too personal, although sometimes, I'm tempted and I do it. It's a weakness. But I actually think that then you can descend into kind of tabloid politics. We've seen a lot of that lately. We actually have to be very clear-headed, very smart, very deliberate. I think one of the great things about the right is also standards, maintaining some standards to the extent that we can. And then I think optimism is also not necessary and maybe not even desirable. I think if I think it's a misreading of Reagan. I mean, Reagan was like a flame-throwing radical. He wasn't the above it all, the great communicator. I mean, even conservatives didn't like him at the time, right? Many conservatives thought he was too extreme, too radical, too polarizing. So we've kind of looked back, but I think that we have people that are in some sense too optimistic. They become naive. Optimism taken to its extremist becomes naive. And so I think we need a balance of pessimism and optimism that is oriented towards seriousness of purpose. That to me seems the thing that's lacking more than anything, is a sense of seriousness and an understanding of the true nature of politics. And I think, look, the right shouting and getting in people's faces is always a loser for us. The left can burn down a city and the media will cover for them. If there's one bad person in a crowd at a conservative rally or something, it tars everybody. And so I think we try to avoid that.
Take a question from the woman in the back.
Yeah, you. Yep.
Oh, I'm sorry. You
Oh,
got long hair.
hey, the long hair. Yeah.
I cannot wait to tell my folks about this. That's hilarious.
Bright lights, long hair.
As a
far
bald
away.
person, I only see the long hair and assume. So.
And what are your pronouns?
Okay, I'm just gonna pretend that didn't happen. So Okay, let's get the giggles out. So anyway, so I'm a big fan of yours. I'm probably the youngest person in the room. I'm only 18. I'm a senior at high school.
All right.
Currently go to formerly T.C. Williams across the river in Alexandria, and it's been completely captured by, for lack of a better term, self-absorbed Marxists. I remember last year I was walking through the hallways at my school, and one of the teachers put up a poster of one of the philosophers you mentioned, actually, Angela Davis, on the wall. I'm just like, what? You know, I was like this is America. Why is this happening? And another instance of this happening was, I was in geometry class, and it was June of last year, of course, Pride Month, Pride before the fall. And I remember my geometry teacher had put up all this whole milieu of let's call it rainbow content. And I was just thinking to myself, I don't think transgenderism has anything to do with geometry. I don't know what's this in here. So my question is, what would be your biggest piece of advice to someone like me who is pretty much trapped in the public school system? I have another 6 months and then I'm out. But not 6 months, 2.5 months. I keep losing track of time. But anyway, so what would be your biggest piece of advice to someone like me who is at a public school? What can I do to, I guess, reduce the suffering a little bit?
Yeah, a couple things, and I think this is a great question, and I'm actually very optimistic about young people. I did an event 2 nights ago at a extremely right-wing avant-garde art space in New York City with hundreds of people, mostly young people with pseudonymous Twitter accounts and radical ideas, and it was galvanizing, and it was like a scene in New York. It's like a cool scene, What's really interesting is that there's this phenomenon. If you look at the left's organizing principles, primarily along race and gender, you have kind of race radicalism, racialist ideology, and then you have kind of gender ideology, gender theory, kind of non-binary, trans, queer identities, etc. This is the first youth subculture in history that is not driven by the youth, but driven by the adults. I mean, really, truly. And so I think that there is a rebelliousness in this country. If you look at especially young men are extremely frustrated with what's happening. They have this rebellious energy, and indulge it. You're young. That's a time for rebellion. And I would say organize a small group of people. You could have 2 friends, 3 friends, 5 friends, 10 friends, God forbid. That's enough to create a block, B-L-O-C, a kind of ideological block within a small institution like a high school. And then you don't have to put up with any bullshit anymore. Seriously. And if the teacher is spouting off, push him on it. And then ask questions, ask hard questions. This sounds bad, and it's not maybe kind of conservative temperamentally, but I think it's justified in this case. Embarrass your teacher in front of others. Make sure he doesn't do that again. I really believe that. And then take the hits. I have a lot of people say, oh, well, I should just shut up and write the paper in college that the teacher wants to get an A. I'm much more impressed with the kid that eats the C and doesn't compromise his principles.
So thank you, sir. That was an excellent question. We are just about out of time, but the conversation will continue with Chris Rufo's work, including his next book, and in the pages of Modern Age at modernagejournal.com. And thank you all for coming tonight. I want to especially thank Athos PR for sponsoring tonight's event, and also the Henry and Ann Paluchis Foundation for all of their sponsorship and support for the Conservative Book of the Year Award. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.